Hello, listener. This is Alex here with a quick insert before this episode gets started. This is a reading club, which is normally available only to our patrons, $10 and up. But we've released this one for free because it's about the left case for Brexit. Why have we released this one for free? Well, one is to give you a sample of what the reading club is like in case you're interested in signing up, but also because we took the opportunity to discuss the global implications of Brexit. What are the possibilities for sovereignty, not just national, but popular sovereignty in a globalized world? The question of Brexit, and indeed earlier than that, Greece's confrontation with the EU, has been the central question of European politics for the past decade and will continue to be so. So I think there's lots of lessons to be drawn from the case of Brexit. And although it might seem now like a fait accompli, whether you're in favor of it or against it, there's many lessons to draw from it. And so along with discussing Richard Tuck's excellent book, The Left Case for Brexit, we also try to draw out some of the wider lessons in this episode. We hope you enjoy. And again, if you're interested in signing up, it's patreon.com/bungacast, and it's for patrons $10 and up. Happy listening. Hello, patrons. Welcome to an Alpha Bunga Bunga reading club. It's the Friday, the 29th of January, and we're discussing Brexit, specifically the book Richard Tuck's The Left Case for Brexit. And the immediate question, I think, prompted by this, before I even introduce George and Phil, is who cares? Who cares about Brexit? It's a done deal. The deals have been signed. It's done. Maybe not entirely satisfactory for any of the parties, really, other than the Tories. But, you know, it's done and you move on and you go back to politics as usual. And that's just from a British perspective. For anybody else, you're thinking, I mean, does it matter? Is there anything to really learn from this? And maybe even, you know, from an even more radical perspective, you're thinking, well, who cares about rich countries and their national sovereignty versus the EU? It's imperialist Britain in a sort of imperialist EU or outside of it. What difference does it make? And why should you care about national sovereignty? Yeah, effectively national sovereignty of rich imperialist countries. You know, why bother? Why bother discussing this? And I don't have an answer for that. So I'm going to pass over to George to introduce the book, and then introduce the topics that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that point about why bother at some point, if we're not just nostalgic for post-politics, to go back to that era before 2016 where nothing really happened. So today's book, The Left Case for Brexit by Richard Tuck. So Richard is Professor of Government at Harvard. He's an expert on Hobbes and sovereignty, and has written a very good book on free riding as well.
Wait, what's free riding?
Free riding, it's when you don't pay. It's like when there is such thing as a free lunch, like you are on the bus that's already going there, so you just hop on.
Oh, I thought it was like not using protection. Okay, I thought something else. Okay, go on.
No, I mean, I don't know if he covers that towards the end of the book. It's been quite a few years since I read it. So this book, The Left Case for Brexit, is composed of a series of essays, many of which were published in The Full Brexit, which Richard calls the main organ of left-wing Brexiteers. And it's important just to say that they haven't been revised. So their responses to what happened at various different points in time, running from the first one in April 2016, so before the referendum, to October 2019. And so they give you a diary of Brexit, if you will, a variety of insights into what was happening in the practical process. So
I think that's actually, just to chip in, I think that's actually one of the great advantages of the book, is that you have these slices of particular moments, and you get a sense of the bitterness and the stop and start character of so much of the struggle over Brexit. You get a sense, in fact, that it was indeed a genuine struggle, a back and forth, not only kind of between clashes and debates in various various places where Richard published some of the essays, but also in Parliament, because a lot of the essays that Richard writes are also accounts of what's happening in Parliament. And he makes the point that part of the intensity of his interventions and the debate itself is part of the restoration of democratic politics in the UK, so that it's appropriate that you have the character of these political debates. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is how his views harden over the course of the book in response to changing circumstances. And I think that's also a lesson of a good advantage of the book.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing, as you say, like how long-winded it was. And reading it in 2021, you're like, I can't believe how long this has been going on. And how, I can remember back to following these debates in 2017, or when Corbyn had the breakthrough in the election, and thinking like how far that still was from the eventual, final signing of the agreements and crossing the T's and dotting the I's and so on.
Yeah, no, I think both of those points really come through, and you can see how the context develops just by looking at the title of some of the essays. Not all the essays are titled, but some of them are. So, and I'll just run through these before maybe we can have a look at a bit of the context and also I guess get into the substantive discussion. But you have one from June 2016, before the referendum, The Left Case for Brexit, which gives the book its title, obviously. July 2017, Brexit, a prize in reach for the left. Then it becomes a bit less positive. April 2018, why is everyone so hysterical about Brexit? And then more specific questions about the multinational British state get introduced. July 2018, how to break up the union. November 2018, the surprising benefits to Ireland of a no-deal Brexit, and then back to the main questions. January 2019, deal or no deal, and April 2019, modest proposals. So a bit of context just for listeners who might need a refresher, might have had enough Brexit at that point in time, and now are eagerly returning to some of these questions. So you may or may not recall, on 23rd of June 2016, that was before this podcast started, but it did happen. It was in recorded history. 23rd of June 2016, referendum on Britain's membership in the EU was held, and on a turnout of 72.2%, 51.9% voted to leave and 48.1% to remain. In terms of regions, England outside of London voted by 242 districts to 52 to leave, and Wales by 17 districts to 5. London, on the other hand, voted 28 to 5 for remain, and all Scottish districts voted to remain. These things come through, obviously picked up in the essays, some of the splits. And although districts don't map exactly onto parliamentary constituencies, it's estimated that 64% of Labour constituencies and 75, depending on various assumptions, of Tory constituencies voted to leave. So another split, and one that arguably proved to be the most important, was that an estimated 64% of constituencies overall voted leave, but only 159 out of 650 MPs did the same. So a big divide. Okay, so analysis has, just to move through these, analysis has also suggested that voting leave was correlated with low income. 64% of those in the marketing categories C2DE, which is sometimes called working class, voted leave, and even more so with educational inequality. So other things being equal, support for leave was 30 percentage points higher amongst those with GCSEs. So those are general certificate of secondary education, i.e. exams you do at 16. So 30 percentage points higher amongst those with GCSEs than or below than those with a degree. So in terms of the reasons why,
can I just jump in on something on that, which is interesting and often forgotten. There was this thing with the whole debate about Brexit, and Remainers always threw this at Leavers, that it was a bunch of old people who wouldn't have to deal with the consequences of their actions, which of course, I don't think is a legitimate point to make. But because older people have as much right to the franchise and a voice as young people do, and indeed exercise theirs with more frequency. So, but the point about educational level. So as George just said, like 30%, 30 percentage points more likely to vote leave if you've got your kind of high school diploma. That also correlates with age, of course, because more and more people are more educated, as you go forward in time in younger and younger cohorts. So that's part of the reason as well that older people voted more for leave, is also because it correlates with lower education.
Yeah. I mean, not to get too much into the political science, but that educational inequality, other things being equal, means you control for age. So it's a really striking.
Oh, even controlling for age. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So it's like, I mean, I think the age point is a good one as well. And these things came to play themselves out in various different culture wars, elements of the discussion. But so just, I guess, finally, in terms of reasons for voting one way or another, although endless debates are possible and indeed proved themselves to be had, exit polls suggested that for those who voted leave, the major concern was, quote, the principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. 49% of people gave that. While the major concern for those voting remain was, quote, the risks of voting to leave the EU looked too great when it came to things like the economy, jobs and prices. And that was 43% gave that as their number one reason for voting remain. So basically, in other words,
I mean, you could sum that up as like kind of wanting control versus risk averse, right?
You could do. I mean, that's one way to do it, and I think we can get into that. But I thought it was just interesting. It's just worth putting it out there that it was not exclusively, as it has been obviously portrayed, a kind of Britain as a global force for remain or draw up the drawbridge for leave. It was obviously a lot more complicated than that.
There is one more element, if I can, about education, which I think is worth making.
Go ahead. You're educated. You can speak in this debate.
Well, thank you very much.
Epistocracy here.
I'm glad. The Bunga epistocracy. No, I'm the insurgent. In fact.
The university lecturer is the insurgent. Interesting.
You're literally calling from your office with all of your books behind you. But go ahead, Mr. Anti-knowledge man.
So one of the debates about this is always that one of the claims that's made in the new kind of the political science splicing is that education matters more than class, because the lack of education correlates most strongly with support of populism, support of Brexit, and being educated, is or having the more qualifications you have, particularly university and high school education, the more likely you are to be anti-populist and in this case pro-EU. And I think what that overlooks is that this in turn, the role that education plays particularly in post-Blairite society in the UK itself reflects prior choices made about class. And I think that's also important to stress. So even though in terms of the patterns and the voting behavior, education always is the most kind of standout phenomenon and the one that people kind of glom onto as the most powerful explanatory factor with respect to the European Union. That seems to crowd out the kind of the class dimension to some degree. It also reflects prior kind of decisions about class, and particularly the decision, the attempt, particularly by new Labour governments, and that were inherited by subsequent governments, to shape a very particular kind of vision of society that would get away from the previous class divisions of British society, that would everyone would effectively be socialized through university, and that would be part of adapting to a new knowledge economy where kind of intangible skills mattered much more to people than, say, vocational training or the kind of training that you receive on the job, and that eventually everyone would be effectively an office worker. Everyone would be white collar, everyone would go to university, everyone would have the same kinds of views. And so that attempt to shape that kind of society was itself a product of a particular kind of class politics, a particular kind of political economy that has, importantly, failed as well. Failed to deliver in terms of productivity, failed to deliver in terms of the promises that it made about improving Britain's growth model, about transforming Britain's political economy and society, not least because so much of it was still dependent on low-wage immigrant labor from the European Union, not only to kind of do service sector jobs, but also to do food processing and agriculture in Britain. Anyway, so I only want to put that in perspective with respect to some of the kind of political sciencey splicing and dicing of the voting patterns. The fact that education stands out so sharply still needs to be contextualized in a wider picture of Britain's class relations and political economy that is itself an artifact of previous political decisions.
Yeah, I guess Richard doesn't engage in those kind of specific arguments all that much. This is almost all the background, which I guess the essays then build off of, because one thing that he's particularly interested in, as we alluded to earlier, is some of the practical political debates, so particularly in Parliament, and some of the, I guess, as a political historian, it's his skill and his training and his expertise to bring out some of the histories of some of the concepts that people are using. So he doesn't go too much in for the regression analyses that are definitely possible on essentially explaining the vote and explaining away the vote, you might even say. But to kind of move on to the more substantive topics, who, as Alex said at the beginning, who cares? This, one, it's over. Two, it's parochial. Brexit, can't we find something more interesting to talk about on a Friday evening?
No.
Yeah, so
that's
sorry.
Let me
rephrase that. It's not about us not having anything interesting to talk about. Why should anybody bother to talk about Brexit on a Friday evening or any day of the week in 2021?
So I think this is one of the really strong points of Richard's book. Is not only is it kind of very tightly bound to the shifts, reversals, dramatic forward strides in the debate over those 4 years, but it's also being an American. Obviously, Richard is British, but he's also American, and he's based in America. He's an American political theorist at Harvard. And what's interesting about that is that he always consistently relates it to US debates, particularly to do with the US. He always makes the comparison, and a lot of the conversation is in fact directed towards colleagues and peers in the US. And he consistently relates it to debates about NAFTA, about the US's integration into NAFTA, and into the various trans-Pacific free trade agreements that were all kind of being engineered prior to the Trump administration. And so I think what comes across very strongly in Richard's book, and this is why it's such a good book to convey the politics of Brexit to a wider audience beyond the UK, is that it's the first, in the post-Cold War era, it's the first major political moment where questions of popular sovereignty have been pitched against supranational arrangements for globalization. So it's the sharpest kind of conflict between different principles of national and political organization, and for a variety of fairly contingent reasons that happen to occur in Britain rather than in any other place in the developed world, at least.
Yeah,
and so I think that's really important, because those are in some ways single most important political and economic debates of our times, is the integration into these vast trading arrangements where so much of our political and economic choices are restricted. And this is the clash, I think, that makes Brexit so important for effectively for everyone around the world.
And I think a lot of people during the whole process and reading the book kind of brought this home in a way, albeit in a kind of negative sense, because it's not what Richard does, but it's what he leaves unsaid, is that at that time, most of the debate didn't engage with that, there wasn't clarity, I mean, amongst a lot of the participants or even observers, that this was a real fundamental debate about sovereignty in a kind of globalized world. Or to the extent that it was dismissed as like, you can't have sovereignty in a globalized world, so stop complaining, as it were.
You can't have popular democratic self-rule and self-government. And so the case that Richard makes very powerfully is that the EU is a variant of the trans-Pacific trading arrangements and the regional trading arrangements in North America, such as NAFTA. It's a very particular variant of these larger global structures that restrict kind of popular self-government throughout the world. And this is what makes it, I think, such an effective book for understanding the wider implications and stakes of Brexit. So in answer to Alex's challenge at the beginning, how Brexit is not parochial in that sense. And this is what comes across in Richard's book.
So just a couple of points. I think we'll return to these in a little bit later as well. But two things which came through on this kind of from the American perspective on Brexit that Richard really draws out. One is the role of constitutions, that kind of perennial American concern, and how this applies to Brexit. And the other is the role of the Supreme Court. And obviously, this again is another hallowed American institution, and seeing how the relationship between Parliament and the judiciary is one of the things that he explores. And all of these things are counterposed to a lot of the other analysis at this point in time, which was about English identity, about culture wars issues, about kind of a lot of ideological froth, you might say, rather than some of the key questions of political structures. So I think really cuts through all that stuff really, really well. But yeah, before we move on to some of the specific themes, anything kind of taking these essays as a whole, anything that either of you have that's worth saying on some of the developments across the essays? We've already talked about the hardening of some of the positions, or the project as a whole.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say, and maybe it's also useful for listeners who maybe haven't read the book but are listening to this anyway, and I guess we always try to endeavor to make it still accessible, even if you haven't read the book as a whole or whatever, if you only managed to read some parts, which is that in relation also to what Phil was just saying in terms of relating it to American debates, is the way that Richard tries to, one, endear his case to an American audience, or maybe rather put it differently, to a left-wing audience, wherever you may be, by pointing out that why is there no British Bernie, and pointing out that Corbyn was not exactly a British Bernie, because Bernie specifically targeted things like the TPP, the NAFTA, and so on, which the British left kind of shied away from, and pointed out as the kind of homology, the similarity between the EU as not just a trading agreement, but as something which locks in certain policies, prevents certain policies from being enacted, and has this whole judicial system which prevents any real challenge to it, which, people will be familiar with the debate around the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where that was also a major issue of complaint, because it wasn't just a trade agreement about lowering tariffs a certain amount or whatever, about allowing or not allowing certain imports, but was about things like investor-state disputes, where basically big corporations can sue a state for not allowing it to do its business in its country, which obviously is really anti-democratic, should be inimical to any left project. And that was very obvious for Sanders, very obvious for a lot of the American left, but that was not clear for the British left, I think, in many cases, in discussion about the EU, and in many cases wasn't even clear about Americans discussing Brexit. Because I mean, it's worth recalling that many Americans were, some were like, "Why do you care about the EU? Yeah, cool, leave. What's the problem?" Others, I think, took the attitude like, "No, this is horrible. This is just nationalist, whatever. This is just like Trump and Britain, etc." You can see the hostility which responded to Alex Gurovich's article in Jacobin a couple of years ago when he made the case for Brexit there. I remember that kind of striking me, because I was like, wow, all these Americans care about, Britain and the EU. Why do they have such a strong position on this?
It is. So, so Richard makes this point very effectively about the European Court of Justice is locks in the capacity for corporations, companies to take states to court, and indeed they have. I mean, this is one of the points he makes is just how neoliberal, consistently pro-capital and anti-labor the court has been in its verdicts and rules, and also the fact as to how it can't be checked. There's no countervailing agency or body with respect to the European Court of Justice in the EU. This is the peculiar thing about the European Union. It is like this grand trading bloc like TTIP or NAFTA, whatever, but it has a romance attached to it that these others didn't. And that, I think, is still one of the kind of abiding puzzles of the European Union, is the way in which it's veiled with all this ideological...
it's got good branding, basically. And as Wolfgang Streeck puts it, it's been sacralized. The idea of Europe and the European Union have been put together, and it's got a really strong... There is no other
trading. Yeah, there is no other trading arrangement which is as sacralized, as has the romantic air that the European Union has, and that is something. But
also partly because some of it's the people, major movers in the founding, the creation, the development of the European Union had grander dreams about it than were actually realized. I mean, the EU itself underwent, I guess, a more neoliberal turn. It was not a foregone conclusion that it would end up what it was. For understandable reason, and some of the ideological icing on the EU cake is stuff that is on surface level appealing. So it's something that has to be grappled with, and indeed we have to kind of chip off that icing to really get to what the reality of the cake is, and it's a cake made of shit. So
that's a pretty
that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's a shit cake with. It's I'm assuming that's hard icing.
It's hard icing. It's hard icing. Yeah.
Okay. So to move, if that cake is the starter, to move on to the main course, which is not shit cake, it's this.
Starting with the dessert.
Yeah. So some of the specific themes, I think, compared to some of the other books that we've done in the reading club, because this isn't a single work, it's a collection of essays, you see some of these themes develop with variations and through kind of repetition and iteration. So it's quite an interesting read just to see that happen. And I think one of the major pleasures of this book is seeing a historian of political thought who is intimidatingly well read, even if his writing requires rather fewer uses of the thesaurus than Perry Anderson's does, apply some of the concepts of his discipline to a situation that really wasn't clear to most observers. For some of the reasons we've discussed, I think a lot of the ideological and cultural points came to overshadow some of the kind of key questions of political structures. And so I picked out three themes that I think are particularly interesting. The first of which, democracy and political authority. This obviously comes through again and again. The second is this point about constitutions. And the third is, and I think these come towards the end when we're really getting to the cut and thrust of the matter, class strategies and political analysis. They're all quite broad, but then again, it's a wide-ranging book, so that's to be expected. So yeah, the first, and so this I think particularly for listeners who've read the book, this first essay or first illustration of the idea of democracy comes through in this essay of the 6th of November 2017, and I think this is a really great essay for a number of reasons. And it formed the basis of a lecture that Richard gave at some London university, UCL or KCL, on active and passive citizens that I thought was really fantastic. Anyhow, this essay, I think it captures the left's desire to help fellow citizens rather than talk about power. Richard references Hillary Clinton, saying that she was in the presidential race to make life better for children and families. And it includes the killer line that this sort of politician, which you could say is characteristic of the modern left, sees the state as, quote, the armed wing of Oxfam, unquote, which I think is, he actually takes that from somewhere else, but it's a great line. And second, it starts to link some of the material changes underlying, the second half, particularly of the 20th century in British society, things like changes in industrial organisation and political structures, such as standing armies being demobilised, to some of the changes in political ideas, and particularly around decreasing support for democracy, or more a movement from one understanding of democracy to another, a kind of, you could say, a pro-social one of democracy as popular sovereignty, to a more technocratic one, democracy as rules, checks and balances, and actually draws on some interesting stats that there's a big divide between those born in the 30s and those born in the 80s in terms of how essential they think it is to live in a democracy, with 75% of those born in the 30s thinking it is, and only 25% of those born in the 80s. And that's drawing on a study by Yasha Monk, I think, and Roberto Stefan Foer at Harvard. So yeah,
we are the 25%.
Well, we'd hope so. So yeah, what do we take of, or what do we make of this kind of reflection of Richard's on the crisis of democracy?
I think, the Armed Wing of Oxfam is brilliant, and I just want to stress it because its brilliance actually didn't occur to me initially until later. Because when I heard it the first time, I thought of it in terms of my area of disciplinary expertise as an employed academic, which is international relations. So I understood it in terms of humanitarian intervention, right? Bombing, that the US and Western states bomb countries to bring them human rights, and that they drop aid parcels or bombs, alternately, it doesn't really matter. But in the context of Brexit, actually, it only later occurred to me that Richard meant it in respect of internally, within Britain itself, and Hillary's attitude towards her fellow citizens. That what's really being said is that they view the state as a humanitarian enterprise, as something which is capable of providing people with various kinds of material benefits, improving their lives, but that has no connection to a vision of self-government or citizenship, or the idea that those people that the state is supposed to be helping have any capacity or power to shape their own circumstances and to impose their will on government and on the people making those kinds of claims. Just to stress, I think the whole point of Richard connecting the idea of state power and state force to this kind of world-renowned British charity was to make a point about domestic politics, not about international politics.
Got there in the end, Phil. No, I think the one of the really striking things, and which I think is almost at the heart of the whole Brexit debate, and this is a point that Pete Ramsey has made, that I have used on many occasions, because I think it's just so good, is that the left has essentially moved from seeing the working class as a subject of politics to the object of politics. So the object of politics, i.e. recipient of charity, material benefits of various sorts, and not as the collective or individual actors who make decisions. And so that Armed Wing of Oxfam is exactly it, that you have a paternalistic or a kind of charitable approach, rather than one that says democracy is for decision making. It's not instrumentally valuable, it's intrinsically valuable. That shift played itself out really, I think, very clearly in the left's response to the left case for Brexit, which we'll get onto in a bit. Alex, anything? Well, of democracy, for or against?
Yeah, for crisis, I suppose. Always for crisis and for democracy. So, the one thing I would add about that, I think, is that, on the one hand, obviously, it's good that the state might help people, or that you might have a sense of community which cares for the most vulnerable and so on. I don't think anybody would object to that, and so we're obviously not excluding that. It's not it shouldn't be a trade-off between care and power, rather that it's only through power that you get care. That's maybe a kind of a ham-fisted way of putting it. But the point is that how could you rely on a Hillary Clinton, for example, to provide you with the things you need for your life to have, a flourishing life, or, to be in charge of your own conditions of life and so on. That's just not going to happen. So whatever she might say in her rhetoric, that her aim is to make life better for children and families, that's not going to be realized without power. And I think with relation to the EU debate, I think that applies even more so, because I'm not, the kind of left Brexiteer vision, I guess, was that the state should just be this nice figure, this nice mother figure who takes care of people, and we should have conciliation and consensus, and that's why the EU and the way that it does its business, which has to be always through consensus and whatever, and where nothing ever really changes, because you need the consensus of 27 different states to really change anything, kind of appeals, because it's this sort of stasis. But the really imaginary part is that the state could ever, to put it in the most basic terms, kind of care for you, because why would it?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's worth flagging that this, I guess this whole debate, not we started it, obviously we didn't, but we have touched on it previously. So in June 2018, episode 40 is a classic from the archive. We spoke with David Adler about his research into the centrists are the bad guys, which showed that essentially support for democracy was lowest amongst those who would put themselves at the center of the political spectrum. So I think that even the right was more pro-democracy than the center, let alone the left. Yeah, and it's worth thinking about how that has proved itself to be true again and again. In
support for the European Union, no less, as well.
Yeah. So just maybe to move actually on to the second theme, that of constitutions. These are all my themes. You won't see these the book thematically divided in this way. So what I think is quite striking is the constitutional view of the EU that Richards develops or explains very, very clearly. So there's an essay from the 26th of April 2018 where Richard frames the EU as a constitutional order for each member state taken separately. The idea here being that it's not some sort of super state which is coming over here to straighten our bananas and tell us what to do. But in fact, it's best understood as a interlocking legal framework which each member state agrees to in a separate way. So what do we make of this? Is this a useful way to understand the EU? Is it politically generative?
I mean, yeah, I think it's very good, and I would relate it also to the episode we had with Quinn Slobodian, and actually we touched on this in the last reading club, reading Wolfgang Strick's recent book about the EU being a sort of economic constitution. And I think that's a good way to think about it. And I think as soon as you think about it that way, I don't think any left-wing person could then be sympathetic to it.
Yeah, I think it also throws open the question of what is a constitution. It's a political compromise between classes at a specific point in time. And I think it's important to, for a whole range of reasons, to be very skeptical of the benefit of constitutions. They lock in certain ways of doing things, certain rules. They advance given trends. And then there is I think one of the things that Richard essentially celebrates or sees a potential in, sees a potential in is, what are the political alternatives, the political options open to Britain, given the lack of constraint from a written constitution. And this, I think, is an important part of the project that he would see realized, and why he defends Brexit as a potential stage in that project.
And again, I mean, Is only to say there's a constant comparison with US politics, and all the pathologies that come of kind of constitutional fetishism in the US, the rigidity, the difficulty of changing the constitution, the way in which that has locked in certain kind of difficulties in US political life, the way in which so much US political life organizes around control of the Supreme Court, the least majoritarian institution of the American state. And so he says all of this is kind of replicated in an even worse way with the European Union. And I think that's because it's even more difficult to change the EU's constitutional structure, because you need a higher level of coordination between all the member states, who aren't ultimately even kind of members of a single political union, which at least you can say about the US. So I think that also is constantly the comparisons, the constant parallel with the US is also a very important aspect of the kind of insights provided in Richard's book, and that also push it past the boundaries of just being a book about British politics.
I think there's also a thing just to add that Richard's book brings up, which I glaze over when people start talking about constitutions, about these institutional structures and methods of voting and whatever. Like, it's just absolute snooze-a-thon. But what Richard's book brought home, and what he lays out very clearly, is the degree to which Britain is such a particular beast, in that it never underwent the constitutionalization, I guess, that France, that the US did, and in those cases were very much done in sort of with an anti-democratic, anti-popular aim in mind. And Britain never totally succumbed to that. So what you have is a House of Commons, at least, which has much greater room for maneuver than other representative bodies, like sovereign bodies, despite the kind of all the kind of feudal encumbrance of Queen and House of Lords and all the rest. This idea, which is often repeated, and I don't know if you don't live in Britain, maybe you've never heard this, but this idea, oh, Britain doesn't have a written constitution. The book explains how, in fact, it's a sequence of acts and laws that have been passed, which actually do form a written constitution, but they are just passed as ordinary laws rather than as a constitution writing, which has a kind of general assembly to write it, and the amendments to it aren't carried out through the need for a supermajority and so on, in the way that you would have in France or the US or any of the other constitutions which have modeled themselves on those original kind of bourgeois republics.
And no constitutional courts, at least until recently, that the British Supreme Court seems to be adopting a role for itself like that. But that this was the advantage of the old model of British politics, was the absence of these unelected bodies that can effectively constrain popular will and elected representatives. And all of this has effectively been lost by Britain's membership, or was lost at least, and by Britain's membership of the US, which is why it's so good that we're out.
So just to pick up on Alex's point about the, I guess the dryness of talking about constitutions, or that kind of that institutional approach to politics, I think this is one of the things that, I don't know, actually probably was the best thing about reading this book, was me realizing, probably very belatedly, that these legal structures and kind of the way in which democracy is encased, or the economy is encased and protected, the economy protected from democratic intervention. This is we talked about this with, as you said, with when we talked about the Strake book, but this is the task at the moment, in one sense. Like we spent a long time in the end of history period, like wondering about mobilization and thinking about, where were these new political actors going to come from? And actually all this time, the distance between majoritarian political institutions and particularly economic processes and economic structures just was growing and growing and growing. And I think this is when Richard talks about the constitutionalizing of British politics. This is exactly what he's referencing, is how these kind of interlocking series of memberships of various agreements and various contracts essentially is a ways in which to stop political contestation of important economic things, of various different things, but particularly economics, and that it's not, in fact, dry and even tedious to talk about these things, but it's gets right at the heart of what the political structures are that we're dealing with. We just haven't been able to see them for quite a while because they've been so all pervasive, and that has been the direction and the manner of government of post-political neoliberals across Europe and including in the UK. So onto the third theme, which, as I said, I think comes through towards the end of the book. So this essay from the 31st of October 2019, which kind of concludes and wraps up the book. So Richard's quite clear here in seeing the EU as a kind of proxy in a culture war. That, you know, this is something onto which various identities have been projected and various I guess kind of domestic political conflicts have been projected and externalized. So, and then he kind of moves through this analysis and ends up quoting Marx on the Chartists and saying that that Marx praised the Chartists for precisely not refusing to ally with their class enemies. So his reading is essentially that there is something really valuable to be gained from this kind of class alliance. What did you guys make of perhaps this this analysis, or this approach or suggestion as to what the left, if you have the left case for Brexit being an intellectual one, the left driving through of Brexit, what that could have been?
You should tell us who the Chartists are before anything else.
So the Chartists were British working class campaigners who advocated, they had 6 demands, which I can't remember off the top of my head, although I should do. And so this was kind of early mid 19th century. So often looked back on as one of the sort of early working class movements. And their demands were all around how to achieve a sort of political equality. They wanted to have various changes, including, as Richard mentions, very memorably in Felix Holt, the book by George Eliot, you see what happens if you have not private voting. It's a free for all, and one of the Chartist demands was against this. So yeah, so he's going back to early working class movements and saying what they're demanding. The Brexit process.
You did have that, though. I mean, you had the former communists setting up Charter 88, I believe, right? Which it was an organization which is kind of pro-democratic reform organization by ex-communists. So, I mean, the Chartists have been used and reappropriated by different groups over history.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was the kind of one of the pathetic attempts to revive British Stalinism in the aftermath of the Cold War, and it was very Charter 88 was kind of very lame. I mean, I think one of their aims, if I recall correctly, was in fact to have a written constitution, and it was kind of the left wing of Blairism. They wanted they wanted kind of human rights and institutionalized in a constitutional document. But it's, I mean, the broader point about the Chartists is political enfranchisement. They wanted to expand British democracy by abolishing the limits on the franchise, the property limits on the franchise, and expanding it to have universal male suffrage, to incorporate the working class into the nation. In fact, as Marx said, that the working class must constitute itself the nation in the Communist Manifesto, and that was the aim of the Chartists. I guess why Engels, Marx's collaborator, called the Chartists the first modern proletarian party. And I think it's right to put it in that context, because essentially the question of Brexit was a question of enfranchisement, though we all have the vote, women as well as men, and propertied as well as unpropertied. The the point of the constitutionalization undertaken by the European Union and neoliberalism has been to make the vote meaningless. And in the case of the debates over Brexit, to even try to overturn the outcome of the referendum, to reverse it, and to take us back into the European Union. So the debate over enfranchisement and rooting it in that debate, I think, is exactly the right context in which to understand it.
That's well put. I want to draw something else from the citing of Marx on the Chartists in the book, which is to George's point, to George's question, which is how does that get us beyond culture war? And I think it's interesting because the thing that he cites, so Marx refers to the opposition to the Corn Laws amongst the Tories, and that effectively the workers sided with the free traders against the Tories. And that was a sort of tactical alliance of siding with your enemy so that you might then have another battle, a later battle and a better battle on kind of more democratic grounds, ones that might be more propitious to you. And that's the analogy with Brexit, that left-wingers should have supported Brexit at all costs so that you may then fight the class enemy, right? So you take away all the restrictions on democracy that the EU brings in. That doesn't mean that it's the end of the game and that everything's settled and that we live in this post-Brexit utopia, but that's a better platform for a struggle later on. And that was something which was really absent from a lot of left-wing attitudes to Brexit, with some good notable exceptions, but in a large swathe, there was a kind of I think a prickliness about or shyness about in any way being associated with what they saw as a right-wing case for Brexit, and that the right-wing case could be was indelibly linked with Brexit itself, that there could be no tearing away for that. And it's interesting, just one thing I asked on Twitter, at the beginning of the month, just because I was thinking not so much about Brexit, but about the US presidential election and just kind of the US culture wars, was that could anybody think of a good example of the left backing the greater evil and backing the greater evil in a tactical calculation, to pursue certain ends, which for me, I wasn't being provocative, but for me, it's a mark of political maturity and sense of political independence and autonomy that you as the left or as the working class decide to ally with someone who is quite far away from you in your politics, to achieve certain ends, so that you might then be able to struggle better in the future, which the left very much doesn't do today, right? It'll often side with the lesser, what it sees as the lesser evil, which often creates worse conditions for struggle in the future. So this isn't, I'm not making an accelerationist point that you should support, the worst capitalist forces to make things worse. Not at all. It's just about supporting those elements which are most democratizing or might provide better democratic grounds for struggle in the future. And I think that sort of tactical, strategic thinking with a degree of independence and autonomy is something that's very often lacking today, because it gets instead drawn into this culture war. Whose side are you on? What type of person are you? And that happened very much in the EU debate. The left wants to be internationalist, therefore it sides with the worst kind of free marketeer, not for free market, maybe the worst kind of sort of technocratic cosmopolitans, because they're seen more as their type of people, rather than really analyzing the lay of the land and the conflicting parties and saying, okay, what horse should we back here so that we can have more democracy, so that we can fight better another day.
Great. So I guess onto the wider implications, or some of the wider discussions and debates around the left case for Brexit, both in this book and more widely. So the first one, and Richard does note this, and he has his account, and it's very striking that essentially the left and the right effectively swapped places over the EU since the mid 1980s. Why? I mean, is this an interesting thing to reflect on, or is this just a quirk of political history?
I think it's interesting, and particularly interesting in Britain. And I think Richard attributes it essentially to once the he attributes it to a few things. So you have the split in the 1983 election when the Social Democratic Party tries to establish itself independent of the Labour Party. It splits the Labour Party vote. And is part of what explains Margaret Thatcher's enormous majority in 1983, parliamentary majority. And that was over Europe because you had the right wing of the Labour Party didn't want to be associated with the Eurosceptic wing of the Labour Party, which stood on a withdrawal from the European Economic Community as it was back then. And then later, once Britain's membership has been firmly locked in under Thatcher, you have the famous speech by Jacques Delors in the late 1980s, where he was one of the most charismatic and dynamic of the presidents of the EU Commission, and he deliberately tried to cultivate a constituency for what was to become the European Union, by cultivating working class organizations, organized labor trade unions, particularly ones that had been in countries where they'd been beaten back. And that was his pitch to British trade unions. And it was at that moment that the left began to see the European Union, or the EEC as it still was then, as a kind of hinterland into which they could retreat. After having been so thoroughly routed by Thatcher domestically, they felt that they could draw on support from what was provided at the European level. And that was deliberately cultivated by Jacques Delors and made Thatcher more skeptical of the European Union. I think it's more complicated than just that. And I think it's more deeply rooted and goes back, in fact, all the way to Britain's role in the Second World War, and perhaps beyond that too. So I think the basic, the story of the 1980s, insofar as they swap around, a lot of it is to do with shifting responses to the EEC, and particularly the fact that the defeated left begins to see it as a crutch for its domestic failures. And I think that is the most important part of the story with respect to the left.
I mean, I guess you could say, sorry, I just wanted to say that, I mean, it appears that both positions are irrational, I guess, or that they're so self-defeating because, as we'll come to discuss what the left case for Brexit is, the left case for Remain seems to be self-defeating. If the left is true about what it wants, remaining in the EU would impede those. That I think is obvious. I mean, at least obvious to us and probably obvious to many of our listeners. The right-wing swap is maybe less talked about because it's seen as maybe self-evident because the right is nationalist and therefore it wants to pursue a nationalist project of, it sees it sees Brexit purely as a nationalist project of national independence rather than being about democracy. But I'm not sure that entirely satisfies it, or at any rate, it's also probably irrational in the sense of being unable to realize its stated aims. So that if you want Britain to have a greater role in the world, to be this global Britain and whatever kind of rhetoric that the right-wing Brexiteers use, it also would be best achieved within the EU. One, because it would prevent any kind of major democratizing reform, any kind of more thoroughgoing social democracy in Britain, but also because the EU Britain as a much relatively weaker power now in a world of the US and rising China, Britain's aims are probably better pursued. I mean, Britain's national interest as conceived by right wingers are best realized through membership of the EU and NATO and all the rest. Would you agree with that?
It's just striking that this exact point was one of the reasons why the right engineered Britain's accession to the EU in the first place, or what became the EU. So the idea that we can punch above our weight, we can have a role in a post-imperial Britain can have a role in the world. That, alongside the desire to neuter any future radical socialist policies through a confinement in a legal order of the market. And these things are, it's surprising how they kind of echo onto kind of left-wing arguments for Remain, but instead of legal order of a market, it's legal order of protections from domestic defeat and from the Tories.
It's one of the best parts of Richard's book, in fact, is he digs up from the archive some of the debates within the Labour Party when it was in government in the 1970s, when Britain first joined the common market, as it was then known, the precursor of the EU. And there's this astonishing where they're very some of the participants in that debate are so astonishingly clear-sighted, where they see membership of the EEC as a way to maintain Britain's imperial role east of Suez, as it was called, and also to maintain itself as a great power. And they saw the other option as not being in the EEC, as not being part of the European Union, was decline to the status of a greater Sweden, was one of the words used that Richard has dug out from some of his analysis of that period. I think it's a remarkable lucidity about the choices that were before the left at the time, and the way that being part of the European Union or its precursors was opting for imperial status. It was opting for prolonging Britain's great power position. And that has been evident throughout the Brexit debate. The most consistent supporters of maintaining British power on the world stage, i.e. its imperial status, were those who supported membership of the European Union.
No, I think that's really well put, and I would agree that kind of political memory is crucial and very interesting to read as well. So, just a final couple of questions. Maybe we should just approach this quite directly, and just so that we've laid it out there explicitly. What was the left case for Brexit, or is the left case for Brexit? In summary, can we put a kind of summarize that quickly, and why was it, including Richard's contribution, so poorly received on the left, the British left?
I mean, I think I'll let you guys say what you think the left case is for Brexit, because you guys have been very active over the past 4 years, actively arguing for it, writing about it, and so on. So I think it might be worth saying what Richard Tuck's case for Brexit is in the book. At least, I don't know him personally, and I haven't read much of what he's written. And I may have read some things on the full Brexit website, but I wasn't entirely aware of who he was and whatever. So for me, it was coming at it afresh, reading the book to see what his left case is for Brexit, because I'm familiar with Kostas Lapafritsa's case, or I'm familiar with your guys' case, but and indeed my own case. But for him, I think it's most telling in his reference, repeated throughout the book, to the Attlee government and the way that it was able to create the NHS through the privatization without compensation of various hospitals, which were previously trusts, something that would be impossible in the EU today. And it might even be impossible under the French Constitution, something that he makes reference to as well. And to make a call back to our discussion a few minutes ago about constitutionalism, and why we should be wary of these constitutions which lock in or prevent political decisions, prevent political autonomy. So I think Richard's case is really hinged on the possibility of what was potentially a Corbyn government or some left government being able to come in and have much greater freedom for maneuver. I mean, there's a principled case, which is that Brexit offers all parties greater freedom of maneuver. It opens up political options. So yes, it allows the Tories perhaps to be able to pursue some dream of Singapore on Thames, of becoming this free market, free trade, extremely low tax sort of haven. Just a nexus for kind of the circulation of global capital. But it also opens up the possibility for a social democratic, or I guess what's called nowadays democratic socialist politics. I don't know what democratic socialist means personally. It's either socialism or it's social democracy, in my opinion, but that's maybe an aside. But effectively, Corbyn's full plan, full program, that's what is if not the maybe principled or abstract case, but is the practical case for Brexit, left-wing case for Brexit. That's at least my reading of what Richard Tuck's writing is.
I mean, I think more ambitious probably than, harking back to the nationalizations of the Attlee government, more ambitious than what Corbyn aimed for. And he also goes into detail, for instance, about the nationalization of the railways, again, which is something which is actually impossible in the European Union. Just to say that the firms running the railway companies could be nationalized, but you couldn't have an integrated transport system in which you controlled both the track and the firms operating the railways themselves.
Like Amtrak, which is funny, again, a reference to US politics that Richard makes, which I thought was quite good.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I think certainly from Richard's point of view, democratic nationhood and the capacity for people democratically to shape their conditions of life, including the economy, that's the strong case that comes across for Brexit. The basic question of popular self-rule and mass democracy. And I think that was always the case the best kind of case for Brexit was that it enhanced the capacity of people, both the vote itself in terms of the context within which it happened, the referendum, and the way in which it was experienced and what people thought they were voting for, and also the gain of Brexit, even if it takes time to achieve, is greater popular rule and greater control, political control for more people over the conditions of their life. And that is more possible in the conditions of a democratic nation than it is in conditions of a member state of the European Union. And that is something which I think has been vindicated through the debate.
Just a quick point on, I guess, Richard's particular left case for Brexit. It's almost that he's, as a political historian or a historian of political thought, he knows all the debates that happened in the 70s and 80s, and is sort of, there's a bit of like, why I think it's an interesting tone in some of the articles in the book, and some of the where he's kind of seeing the response to his article in Dissent, the left case for Brexit. Like, why are people treating the EU differently from all these other free trade agreements? It doesn't, like, why can't people see what's really going on here? These arguments, long-standing in the Labour tradition, why are people not reaching for them to try to defend a specific political line in this debate? And just quickly, it's probably worth making the distinction between Brexit and Lexit. So I think often the left case for Brexit is put in terms of this cursed word Lexit, which is essentially Brexit is good on the condition that it leads to a Corbyn government or the great opportunities for Corbyn or for radical Labour intervention. But I think, and this is actually, I think put very well, have to admit in a Medium post by Phil, that there's, credit where credit's due. I'm not afraid to give credit where it is due. That Brexit, that the left.
Thank you for your kind generosity. That's really generous. And
so yeah, and that the left case for Brexit doesn't inhere in the instrumental or possible positive political consequences, but that it is exactly all the things that you just said there, Phil. It's a removal of a constitutional framework that limits and reduces popular sovereignty, and that's what the left is about on one reading, at least. So yeah, to move on to the political question, why
can I just say one thing about that as well? I mean, I think maybe taking up some criticisms that I could imagine coming, and criticisms even that I've made as well, that seems awfully arid. Yeah, removing constitutional constraints, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, okay, but when do we get the good stuff that we care about, right? And I think it's better to see Brexit then, not as something to be accomplished or now as a fait accompli, but rather as a process, a process of part of a wider democratizing politics, which starts with the EU, because that's the first hurdle, I guess, that you have to cross, and also because that hurdle was there. This is your roads, jump. That basically by a strange confluence of events, you had this referendum on Europe, which kind of happened in some sense by accident, a product of the Tory party's internal fissures. Which was never meant to actually lead to Brexit. It was a way of assuaging the Tory Brexiteers, but there it was, and so there you have to fight that battle, and you fight that battle in the same terms that Marx described the Chartists, of supporting the free traders against the Tories, because then because of the future struggles that will allow for. And I think that's maybe a better way to put it, especially in the eyes of those who see discussions of removing constitutional constraints as a little bit too technical, maybe a bit abstract, and not really related to the actual achievement of left-wing goals.
Well, I think it's that is a mistake on their part, I think, as well, precisely because so much of democratic life and so much of political life has been precisely neutered through the being restricted by all the arid regulations and all the annexes of these vast free trade agreements, which only specialists and WTO lawyers and all the rest read, and precisely for those reasons. That its attention needs to be drawn to.
I think what I'm getting at is that those aren't felt restraints. I think in people's lives in many cases. I mean, actually, for fishermen, it is, because there's the fishing quotas, and for people who have strong anti-immigration sentiment, it's felt because they feel that why does the government have to defer to the EU when we want to restrict immigration? Why can't we just do it? But for a lot of left-wing people, and this maybe is a reflection of the weakness of the left, the lack of its own project, that it doesn't feel those constraints. And so it's like, well, why are we bothering with this EU stuff? Let's just get going with the stuff that we can do, right? Try to win an election and try to implement some policies which roll back at least neoliberalism. That's the armed wing of Oxfam view of politics. Exactly that. I don't think it is. I'm not sure that that's entirely fair. I think there's a view that it's not just we want the state to be nice and caring, but that let's elect a Corbyn government in the case, as he was leader of the Labour Party at the time, and have him increase taxes on the wealthy, redistribute income, and whatever, all things that are possible within the EU. Why not just do that? And look, I'm playing devil's advocate. I don't think that's no, I know, but I mean, view, I think that was the view. They promised broadband, and the Navarra wing of the movement, of the Corbynist movement, famously promised fully automated luxury communism. So they promised lots of material improvement. They were showering material improvement upon people that they took to be powerless and whose vote they didn't guarantee that they would respect. So I mean, I think the armed wing of Oxfam was exactly what happened. And but I think steel manning it, right? Like taking the strongest version of their argument, not the weak version of their argument. No, but I'm not taking either. I'm taking the version that was actually made in the election in 2019. And towards the end of the election campaign in 2019, it quickly began to dawn on them, their internal polling, that they were losing the so-called red wall constituencies, the old Labour constituencies in the North and the Midlands. And Owen Jones started writing articles about how activists needed to go from the Southeast up to those constituencies to make the case. And that was the armed wing of Oxfam, if ever there was one. That was, the kind of go to like humanitarians to distant, remote places to make the argument for why the Labour Party should deserve your vote. It was entirely self-defeating, and I think that vision of politics was defeated, in fact, and so it's very much embedded in the left.
So yeah, just a quick point to wrap this up, and maybe this is being too crude, but Richard's left case for Brexit was written before the referendum, and maybe you could have a bit more sympathy to some of those quote unquote arid points. Point of clarification. You mean the left case for Brexit, the initial essay of the book? Yeah, the initial essay, 6th of June, 2016. But once you'd had the referendum, the left case for Brexit is there was a vote. We should defend that vote because that's the only fucking power that we've got. So I think, I do have there are some points around this kind of, constitutionalizing. It's not the snappiest, sexiest stuff. But that was one thing that's obviously, stuck with me, was the willingness to throw the democratic vote out with the bathwater or whatever. But yeah, just maybe to kind of, yeah, you know what I mean.
Should go back to cakes. We were on firmer ground then.
Yeah. And you should throw out bathwater, by the way. I mean, you shouldn't just retain it.
Yeah, you don't want to throw out the democratic baby with the bathwater. That was what you meant. You don't want to throw out the baby. That's right.
Yeah. No, you definitely don't. I mean, that would be.
And I'm not sure if we're on firm ground with cakes, because cakes are soft.
Who are you calling democratic babies? That's
infantilizing the electorate,
which is exactly.
terrible stuff. So, okay, just to maybe, just a final question here, and we've touched on this a little anyway. Why was this not more widely received, or maybe actually to put a bit of a finer point on it, what lessons, if any, will the left learn from Brexit? Was it wrong to be pro-Brexit, or is it wrong to be on the left?
It's a good question. So I think Richard, from conversations with him around the full Brexit, so full disclosure that George and I were part of the full Brexit with Richard, just in case that had been lost on some of our listeners. Perhaps you got some new listeners. But anyway, Richard is fairly optimistic because he sees it simply as the greatest space that is open for democratic intervention, particularly in economic life in the wake of Brexit, means that it can work spontaneously through the self-interest of politicians, that politicians who want to get elected will simply start making promises and pulling, kind of saying, seeking to pull levers of state power that they had no interest or incentive to do so before. So I think, at least over the medium to long run, he's fairly optimistic about the lessons that will be learned, in the sense that there simply is tactical electoral advantage in the aftermath of Brexit, and some of that I think is already being evident in the kinds of economic promises that the Tories are trying to make to keep their constituencies, to keep their lock on the new constituencies that they won from the Labour Party in 2019. So Richard's fairly optimistic.
I think I'm quite pessimistic, or more. Sometimes I listen to some of the post-left podcasts and think, I completely agree. My experience of trying to organize events around Brexit, people who would self-identify more on the left were not very sympathetic to these arguments around democracy and popular sovereignty, and it could obviously have been due to the very real limitations in my ability to make these arguments, but it didn't seem like there was that that orientation that I would kind of agree with, in terms of being fundamentally in favor of democracy. So I don't know. I mean, the most pessimistic projection or kind of prediction that I would have is that the left kind of learns the lesson, and I've made this point a number of times, that majorities aren't required. They aren't good. In fact, it's better to be part of a moral minority. You can sell your politics in a lot better that way. So I think there's a lot to be, I'm not doom pilled, or whatever the pill is that makes you bad or negative. But I think we're undergoing a realignment in British politics and in more widely as well. So I don't think, these things aren't taken for granted.
You're not doom pilled, George. You're bunga pilled, and those are the pills that we sell to everyone.
Yeah, but those pills are different pills. If you say bunga pilled, you're not going to be making very coherent political analysis, particularly if you, I don't know, double drop, listen to 2 episodes.
That's my bunga pills. My bunga pills, like, they give you great analysis.
Yeah, it makes me intellectually erect. That's what we sell. Anyway, so to respond to one thing which occurs to me about, there's a kind of correlate, an analogy to be made with debates over free speech, and left-wing opponents of free speech are the most execrable, worst people in politics. I think it's a completely, I can always try to see try to see an argument in its best light, but left-wing opponents of free speech are the worst. And they're the worst because they can't possibly imagine that they would ever come across restrictions on their own speech. Their ambitions are so low, they have so little to say that might be in any way outside the mainstream or challenging to power, that they can't imagine that there could be any real problem with restrictions on free speech, and that they're deluded in thinking that those restrictions actually work for them. And there's a sort of homology with the Brexit case, less strong, and I don't see left-wing Remainers in the same light as I would see left-wing anti-free speechers. But the homology is this, that they also have such limited ambitions that they don't imagine that the restrictions that the EU imposes on sovereign democratic politics could ever really affect them. that it's just something that we have to live with. We live with those constraints, and we try to make do in our little space, that the little space of politics that is allowed in the 21st century at the end of history. So I think that is maybe an interesting way to see it, that it's the lack of ambition and the lack of drive, lack of larger political goals, which prevents maybe some left-wing people from seeing the severe restrictions that membership of the EU imposes.
Yeah, I mean, that could be one way to put it. I guess the reality is
okay, or disagree, if you do.
No, I was trying to segue into a point on a completely different subject. But I think I think my politics have become way more blunter and less subtle and cruder. Brexit good, free speech good. So yeah, I don't want to take on...
Maybe you've just become more left wing, George. Is that possible?
So left wing, I'm right wing now. Maybe.
Oh,
who knows?
No,
so I think there's just as for all the kind of the strength of the analysis in this book, it is worth saying that the traction achieved by Richard's analysis, by the full Brexit, was not what you might have thought it could be. So there's a big question as to, I want to talk about success and failure, but in terms of having political goals and then achieving them, what were those goals and were they achieved, and what's the legacy of that project going to be? All good questions. But yeah, final word to either of you guys. Do you want to throw in a new idea?
Nothing new, I suppose. I'm fairly pessimistic as well, I think, about the what lessons will be learned. I can't see that they're percolating particularly at the moment. And I guess we'll see about Richard's point about the electoral advantage that now lies in a Britain that has left the European Union, how far politicians take advantage of that and how far it's related to greater autonomy that we have outside of the European Union. We'll have to see. I tend to be more pessimistic than Richard is on that question.
Just to round this off, I mean, it might be useful if either of you could explain what is the quality of Brexit, which is to say, what is the nature of the Brexit that's actually happened? And does that differ from the Brexit that you had in mind? I think the situation is a lot muddier. I mean, it certainly has an example to use and a lesson to learn. We've discussed Syriza and the drama of 2015 in Greece. And I think that's a much more dramatic case. It's a sexier case. There was so much more at evident risk in Greece's situation because of its dire economic straits, which don't apply to the British case, which make it maybe a less sexy case, but I don't think it's one where there aren't lessons to draw from. I mean, I think we were very clear.
We're not sexy enough for you, Alex.
No, well, because, no, Britain's never been sexy.
You're a Brazilian, and we're not sexy enough for you, but Greeks are.
No, yeah, well,
why are you so?
Yes, yes, but also because there was so much. There was more evidently at stake there in terms of the immediate material realities of leaving the EU, of crashing out of the EU in the way that the Brexit case doesn't seem to be. But I think, as we made the case in the post-UK election 2019 episode, that it was a huge missed opportunity from the point of view of the Labour Party, of Corbynism, to not have fully backed Brexit, to have shied away from it, because they could have been instead leading a government and being able to enact many of its more radical reforms. And I think that's a lesson to draw. And if you think, if you support those sorts of politics, if you support Corbynism, they fucked up and they lost because they failed to back Brexit. And in a way that defeat was entirely deserved because of that.
So just to touch on the point about, what is the nature of the Brexit that we did get? I think it's worth saying it's not the full Brexit. And don't worry, this isn't some rallying cry. I think the reality is that Britain will still act like a member state of the EU. The process of detaching Britain from this organization will be a long and complicated one. And what, the argument was always that Brexit is an opportunity for popular sovereignty, greater democracy, economic renewal. It's it's a process. So it's not a straightforward, tick that off the list. We've got socialism tomorrow or communism or anything good. It's still the conditions of member statehood still largely pertain. There is a void of representative politics. Brexit doesn't just paper over that. There is we're in a condition of a mass demobilization of the public in condition of lockdown. There is a long way still to go. So the quality of Brexit is a reflection in part of the political circumstances that produced both the referendum and the debate afterwards. And this is one where the British left is very, very weak, if it exists at all, and has a bit of a ambivalent relationship to democracy. So that's where we're at the moment. But as you said, this is roads, so we can jump around here.
Phil, sorry, just to jump in. Is there anything you want to say in terms of what the actual deal is? I think our listeners might not be aware of it. I'm not fully aware of, and we don't need the total ins and outs. But where is Britain's position with regard to the EU, and in reference to all the discussion we've had about constitutionalization? Where does this leave Britain? How much more freedom of maneuver does it have?
So it's an interesting question, and I think it's still open to, we'll have to wait and see. There is a deal we're in a no tariff trade deal so there is a deal on goods between the European Union and Britain. There is no deal on services yet. That's still to be determined. And the precise mechanism by which the deal is overseen, the various bilateral bodies effectively for overseeing the nature of the relationship, all of that, how they will work and how much British governments of the future will seize the advantage in those future negotiations with the European Union in these various kind of technical bodies for overseeing the future relationship. That is yet to be seen. And it's probably best if we'll include a link to some of the reading, which will give listeners a better breakdown of some of the detailed aspects of the deal.
Yeah, I think that's the piece on the full Brexit website is very long and detailed. But I think to make a more kind of polemical point, one thing to bear in mind is that it does reduce the room to hide that our politicians now have. So going forward, whatever the nature of the post-Brexit settlement will be, it's increasingly the responsibility of our representatives to do that. So that's that sort of accountability is an important aspect of it all. Okay, very good. Should we leave it there? I think the one thing we should highlight is our next reading club, which is will be recorded at the end of February, Thursday, the 24th of February, and it'll be on Deleuze's postscript on the societies of control, which is very apposite in light of Western states' reflexive, and not just Western states, of course, because China started it, reflexive lockdowns and attempt to effectively control societies instead of actually trying to resolve the problems of the pandemic. So that's what we've got coming up in a month. It's actually a short reading, so plenty of time to get through that. I can't remember how long, but it's maybe 10 pages at the most. And do send in your questions, comments, points, shout at us if you want to, whatever. So that'll be up in a month. And well, that's it for now. We will be also announcing, we already did, but we're going to be announcing them again, all the readings for the next, well, basically for the rest of the year. So you can get planning, you can get reading, and plan your time around that. Thank you for listening. Catch you later. Bye-bye.